Chapter 8. Imitation, Plagiarism and Faking. The artist's passion for the antique. Brunelleschi, Donatello and their followers. Florence, the School of Padua, Venice. Imitation, Plagiarism and Faking. The Plaquettes and their curious transformations of some Greek and Roman originals. The character of the imitations and that of the intended victims. There is no occasion here to lose oneself in arguments as to whether the artist was the primal cause of the awakening of the taste for the antique, or whether it was a mere synthetic translation of a sentiment already awakened through complex causes, the main one being perhaps classic literature. Classicism, lately developed into an entirely pagan aesthetic sentiment, a combination of Philhellenic and Latin tendencies, may as well have influenced art as life in general, a sentiment that at the moment of its maturity aroused anathematic protest from Savonarola and a momentary reaction of pietism. However, the preaching of the friar and his colossal bonfire of art treasures in Piazza della Signoria were mere incidents in the course of Florentine tendencies of art. The Piagnoni in Florence may have converted Botticelli and a few other artists, but the pagan sentiment was not dispelled. For the artists of the last part of the 15th century, San Giorgio and Perseus were, if not identical, to be treated with the same artistic sentiment. The real evolution, in our opinion, begins with Brunelleschi and Donatello. In the year 1404 these two artists undertook a journey to Rome. For the progress of art this is a memorable date. The real influence of Greek and Roman art on the artistic movement immediately preceding the Renaissance begins at that date. It is undeniable that even before this time mythological subjects had become familiar to both painters and sculptors. Artists preceding Donatello and Brunelleschi, such as Piero di Giovanni Tedesco, Niccolò di Piero Lamberti, called Il Pella, and even Nanni and Antonio di Banco, show slight traces of Roman art at times, even to the way of working the marble, as in the ornaments of the north door of the Duomo in Florence by Giovanni Tedesco, but they are faint and uncertain traits, leaving one undecided whether they may be attributable to Roman influence or a mere inheritance from the Romanesque blunt-edged way of working the marble. The years spent in Rome by Donatello and Brunelleschi seem to have moulded the style of these two artists entirely anew, particularly that of the former. The citizens of Rome were more or less surprised at the persistency with which the two artists endeavoured to unearth fragments of old statues, and supposing them to be animated by a mere mercenary hope that of finding some treasure, they called the two students quelli del tesoro, treasure seekers. It is undeniably true that, however profitable their search for old coins and marble relics, their copies and study of ancient art were in the sum total more valuable than the solid gold they brought back with them to Florence. The results are plainly visible in Brunelleschi's architecture and Donatello's sculpture, and the influence that their art exercised over their contemporaries and followers. As we have said, after his sojourn in Rome, Donatello, particularly, seems to have immersed his art in a bath of past paganism. His art is no fakery, nor is it sheer plagiarism of the antique, but it is all permeated with Greek and Roman reminiscences, and comes at times so close to Greco-Roman art that it misleads connoisseurs. Speaking of Donatello's art, Louis Quirezio, a well-known connoisseur, observes, he entered so deeply into the spirit of antiquity that some of his restorations of statues are very puzzling, and it is difficult to distinguish his handiwork from that of the original. In fact, the famous horse's head of the Naples Museum was catalogued as a Greek bronze before it was recently attributed to Donatello or his school. No one can fail to draw a comparison between Donatello's Puttino and the infant with the goose, a typical example of Greco-Roman art. One of the first to be affected by the new sentiment in art was Lorenzo Giberti. As a matter of fact, Giberti not only became enamoured of the antique, but was seized by the passion of collecting the best antiques in marble and bronze. You may be sure that collectors of this calibre unlike the Roman samples, talked very little of patina and a great deal of form, that their enthusiasm was of a higher alloy even than that of present day collectors, who are rarely artists or even real lovers of art. Polycletus and Lysippus were Giberti's idols and Greek art his worship. For the era of imperial Rome he had no enthusiasm. His cult for the Greek went so far as to induce him to reckon time by the Olympiads in his chronology. Instead of telling us that a certain artist died when Martin V was Pope, or in the year so and so, Giberti states amazingly that the event took place in the 438th Olympiad. It is not surprising that an artist like Giberti, and such a lover of Greek art as he was, should be able to classify Greek art at sight, to discriminate it from dubious Roman products and all the art that so closely resembles certain Greek periods. That the worship of pagan art was practised by artists with no risk to themselves may be explained by the circumstance that the time of religious intolerance had passed. Intolerance, comprehensible perhaps in the early times of Constantine, when it was a crime for an artist to go to the forms of the past, had gradually sunk into tradition by the dawn of the new era which paved the way to the Renaissance in art and to humanistic tendencies, the most tolerant and unprejudiced period of past civilization. Lovers of art in this period appear to possess a certain refinement of feeling that the Romans did not have. They stand more as friends to the artist, esteem him more, and thus their pursuit has a wider scope. Even Giberti, with all the restrictions placed on his taste by his infatuation for the antique, was, according to Vasari who describes his collection, no narrow specialist in the so much praised modern meaning of the word, namely a collector who may be useful to the history of art and to knowledge at large, but who does not as a rule possess a spark of love for art or artistic feeling. As is often the case today, the heirs of these old collectors were at times more greedy for money than a reputation for art. Many fine collections were scattered to the four winds, which was also the fate meted out to Giberti's collection by his relatives and heirs. Fortunately, a few pieces of this stupendous collection have been saved. A fine torso of a satyr can now be seen at the Uffizi. There are other pieces too that have come down to us, but the finest works, those attributed to Polycletus, among them a rare ornamented vase, are now lost. The new artistic feeling perpetuated itself in architecture from Brunelleschi to Alberti. The latter built for Malatesta what purported to be a church, but which is in fact nothing but a temple to love, which the tyrant of Rimini erected and dedicated to the memory of his lady love, Isotta Atti. The revolution in sculpture effected by Donatello seems to have been felt in Padua and Venice. Imitations of all sorts and probably faked antiques date from this time. It is difficult to decide whether Donatello's genuine pagan sentiment, his second artistic nature, was solely due to his passion or to a desire to accommodate the general taste for the antique. Italian artists are far too versatile. However that may be, he was no faker. The art of the faker flourished when imitators had lost all artistic personality, becoming mere craftsmen catering as usual to a momentary mania. Then was the time one saw Filarete indulging in the most absurd medals and portraits of dubious, very dubious, historical correctness. Riccio in Padua fabricating and flooding the market with charming little bronzes in which the imitation is so evident that it brings up the question as to what the art of Andrea Briosco, called Il Riccio, might have been, had he chanced to be born at another epoch. Vellano also alternates fine pieces of work with little bronzes that must have been in great vogue with collectors of antiques. It is to be noted that the mania is not confined to Italy. It takes that country by storm because of its tremendous artistic activity and the fact that in art it is the foremost country of the time, but others were affected too. France is the first as being the nearest tributary to Italian supremacy in art. There are many examples of what we have said, but perhaps one of the most eloquent is the decoration of the castle of Gaillon, where there are some medallions with portraits of Roman emperors of a most mystifying character. Through the work of Italians at the end of the Quattrocento they were classified as antique, antiquae, only a few years later, at the beginning of the 16th century. An evident proof that Quattrocento imitations were not always directed by artistic fancy, but rather by the love of gain by means of fraud and fakery, is given by the fact that some of the statuettes imitating the antiques were cast with broken limbs. The Ambras collection of Vienna has one of these curious specimens, a charming figure, a female nude. This piece has evidently been cast without arms, the clay model having been mutilated before the form was taken for the cast. In the Prado of Madrid there is also a bronze statue of the Renaissance, possibly a cast from the antique, the peculiarity of which is that the arms have been added afterwards as though in restoration. The metal of the arms is of a different alloy and the modelling of these parts purports to be of a much later date than the rest of the statue. The first pieces to show a positive character of fakery are imitations of old coins and medals. Then small bronzes called plaquettes, often pastiches of antique models, when not actually reproductions from old cameos. The Renaissance has also produced many bronze statuettes that seem to have had no other purpose than to take in the amateur, to gratify his demand for antiques by launching spurious products upon the market. The artists responsible for them represent what might be styled the aristocracy of fakers. There is nothing banal about them, their work is generally good, so much so that these imitations have now acquired a value per se. Antonio Pollaiolo, the Florentine sculptor, is one of the most charming imitators of the antique. The flute player of the National Museum of Florence is perhaps one of the most convincing examples of this statement. Hercules and Antaeus is also a remarkable work by this artist, though the other is superior on account of its simplicity. Of the flute player there are copies of the same period in the Cluny Museum and at Avignon. Curiously enough this statuette tempted even the pencil of Raphael, who reproduced it in a sketchbook now kept in the Academy of Venice. As soon as he had left the goldsmith's shop, Andrea Del Verrocchio started the early period of his activity in his new career as a sculptor, and made his way, according to Vasari, by casting small figures in bronze. We know very little of these small statuettes of Verrocchio's, beyond attribution, but, Vasari says, Verrocchio was tempted to make them while in Rome, because he saw how appreciated were antique statuettes, so much so that even fragments fetched fancy prices. Being an excellent craftsman with the chisel and skilled in the casting of metals, Verrocchio would seem to have been fully equipped for catering to the demand of the amateurs of his time. Vellano, in his imitations of the antique, seems at times to have even been tempted to counterfeit Egyptian art. His art in imitating is eclectic and most versatile. Andrea Brisco seems to possess the brusque touch of some antique sculptors combined with the mania of Roman foppishness in overdraping his statuettes. They are invariably arrayed in gorgeous consular armour, elaborate togas, imperial sandals, and have, as a remarkable contrast, wild, vulgar faces in complete disharmony with the rich decoration of the costumes. However, when the artist models horses or simple nude figures he gets closer to the original, and is evidently an excellent and dangerous imitator. The bronzes of the Paduan school that may, with more or less certainty, be attributed to Riccio are endless, and in some of them the intention of faking is evident. Jacopo Sansovino, the presumed author of the bronze statuette of Meleager of the Puteles collection in Berlin, does not seem to take the trouble to disguise the origin of his plagium. Michelangelo was too great a personality as an artist and too highly gifted to be tempted to hide his genius and waste his fine energies on imitation of the antique. Yet the story of his sleeping Cupid, sold in Rome as an antique, is very instructive. Though well known, it serves admirably to illustrate the character of the amateurs contemporary to the great sculptor. The anecdote casts a certain justified suspicion that the collectors of the Renaissance and early 16th century must have been duped on a larger scale than we are led to suppose from the scanty information we possess on the subject. Vasari informs us that Michelangelo sculptured from a piece of marble a life-sized sleeping Cupid, that in this work he had imitated the antique to a surprising extent, so much so that when the work was shown to Lorenzo di Francesco de' Medici. The latter advised the sculptor to send the work to Rome and sell it as an antique as, by this means, he could obtain a far better price. According to Vasari, the Cupid, marvellously arranged and coloured like an old piece of sculpture, was taken to Rome, buried in a vineyard, and then "discovered" and sold as an antique to Cardinal San Giorgio, who paid 200 ducats for the work. A ducat was worth about 9 shillings. Vasari adds that the person who had acted as go-between in the affair tried to cheat Michelangelo by saying that the Cardinal had only paid him 30 scudi, a scudi was worth about 4 shillings, and he then comments on the Cardinal's poor taste in not giving the Cupid due consideration after he had discovered that it was modern. He says, not recognizing the merit of the work, which consists in perfection, wherein the moderns are as good as the ancients, the Cardinal did not know how lucky he was to own a genuine work by Michelangelo in the place of heaven knows what poor product of some modest master of antiquity. Condivi repeats the story, which has given ample food for popular fancy and folklore, adding that the irate cardinal caused the man to be arrested and, giving him back the Cupid, claimed and received the sum paid for it. The fact that Michelangelo, who went to Rome in the year 1496, wrote in July 1496 to Lorenzo di Francesco de' Medici that he had paid a visit to the Cardinal di San Giorgio, shows that the prelate did not bear the artist a grudge for the joke. In this letter Michelangelo tells Lorenzo Medici that he has tried in vain to get the Cupid back from Baldassare Milanese, the dealer and go-between in the affair of the Cardinal, but seeing that the man is obstinate in his refusal to give back the statue, he has been advised to use Cardinal San Giorgio's authority. Condivi says that in some unknown way this statue passed into the hands of Duke Valentino and finally became the property of the Marchioness of Mantua, who owned it at the time Condivi, the historian and Michelangelo's pupil, was writing. After the small statuettes, Roman busts are a source of some excellent imitations. Of these works, both in marble and bronze, many museums possess good examples. The Uffizi Gallery has 2 or 3 good ones. Besides these, the many restored busts and statues of this same gallery speak of the characteristic pliability and plagiarism in the art of the Renaissance. A fine bust in bronze of a hypothetical Roman emperor, formerly in the collection of Baron de Villiers, is now in the Louvre Museum. It is evidently the work of an artist of the versatile and prolific Paduan school. This very school of Padua, strengthened by the advent of Vittore Camelio, Cavino, de Bassiano and other capable fakers of art, we feel we need not scruple to use the word in association with these names, is chiefly responsible for those coins, medals and small bronzes that it would be naive to say were made solely for the sake of imitating. The imitations of bas reliefs prepared perhaps the popularity of those small bronze bas reliefs called plaquettes, which seem to have meant so much to the collector of the time. We even find the angelic Mino, the last Renaissance artist who should have attempted to paganize his sweet aesthetic art, trying his hand at these marble bas reliefs of Roman emperors, re-edited for the benefit of amateurs. These bas reliefs already seem to have inveigled artists into palming them off with fantastic tales, giving them what might be called a shampoo of history. In the Brunswick Museum there is a bas relief in marble, evidently aping antique art, representing an Aristotle in an absurd pointed headgear and with the following inscription: Aristoteles o Aristos ton philosophon. A replica of this bronze belonged to Charles Timball's collection and is now in the possession of Monsieur Gustave Dreyfus. A third with an identical inscription is kept in the Modena Museum. A fourth is in the Correr Museum of Venice, and finally, a fifth sample of this fantastic Aristotle is in the National Museum, the Bargello of Florence. It is certain that there was a companion piece to this Aristotle, the portrait of Plato, which has come down to us in material other than bronze, but which must have once been the pendant of the Aristotle, as there are clay reproductions of both portraits, the Aristotle being identical to the ones already quoted. Of Plato there are several bas reliefs in marble, one in the Bavarian Museum of Munich, the other in the Museum of Arezzo and another in the Prado. In the latter museum there is also an Aristotle in marble with its freakish head covering, long hair and a long beard. Of Plato there are two marble bas reliefs, two medallions. In the larger one there is the inscription Platonos Atheneo. A curious fact to be noticed is that of these two portraits Aristotle's must have caught public fancy more than that of his philosophical companion, not only because of the numerous reproductions of the one original, but because it must have been popular already in the time of Louis XII, being reproduced in clay in a medallion of the castle of Alluy at Blois. In this race for popularity in a foreign country and from spurious origin, Plato seems to have lost nearly half a century, as we find a reproduction in the castle of Écouen in the middle of the 16th century, which landed finally in the Museum of French Monuments, where Baltard renamed it as the portrait of Jean Boulon. No strange transition when one considers that a cast of the original Plato was, for quite a long time, shown in the Louvre as a portrait of Philibert Delorme. The Louvre has a queer marble medallion, a work of the beginning of the 16th century, of a Roman Imperator Caldusius, and a medallion of Cato is now in the Museum of Beauvais. When Vespasiano de Bisticci tells us that Niccoli had in his house an infinite number of medals in bronze and silver and gold, and many antique brass figures and many marble heads and other valuable things, we can believe that they were genuine, but when it is a question of a later collection of old marble heads, bas reliefs and medals, we wonder how many an Emperor Caldusius it contained. This curious trade-in and mania for pastiche was assisted, it must be added, by the tremendous skill that the artists of all periods of the Renaissance seem to have possessed in moulding, recasting and composing one piece from two or three originals. We know that Verrocchio used to make plaster casts of living people, and the custom of making bust portraits and medallions from death masks was quite common in the Quattrocento and later. Such post-mortem reproductions were often ably disguised by the modelling stick, while other times they showed only too plainly their ghastly origin. A regular riot of fakery, combined with the most fantastic metamorphoses of Greek and Roman originals, existed for the benefit of crazy numismatists, greedy collectors of medals and amateurs with a fancy for small bronze bas reliefs. In the 15th and 16th centuries the imitation of coins was most varied. Some are quite excellent reproductions of the antique ones, others again show the art and style of the artist and his period but faintly disguised. Some of these latter are at any rate charming works of art. The coins, medals and small bronzes seem to emphasize the Renaissance media for the antique. Now, for instance, after giving the portrait of Adam, Eve, Noah and Ham, Shem and Japheth, the Promptuarium Iconum Insigniorum a Saeculo Hominum, published in Lyons by Guillaume Reville, 1553, gives other engravings purporting to be authentic portraits of various personages of antiquity. As a matter of fact, many of these portraits are copied from old medals that were circulating at the time, the work of the 15th and 16th centuries. Mr. Courajot, the former curator of the Louvre Museum, was able to prove this by finding some of the medals from which the portrait of the Promptuarium Iconum had been copied. These portray Antigone, the lieutenant of Alexander the Great, the king of Phrygia, Lysimachus, king of Thrace. The first, an Italian bronze of the 15th century, is characteristic for the effort made by the artist to counterfeit the oriental style he may have noticed, perhaps, in other coins of the time. But, as we have said, where the fancy of the faker really ran riot was in those small bronzes of various origin and still more varied purpose, nowadays called plaquettes. These bronzes were sometimes cast from the form of an old cameo, at others they were imitated or aped a like origin, and whether they may have been used as buttons, pommels on the hilts of swords, or simply been demanded by collectors, they were for the most part imitations of the antique. In these works the metamorphoses of the original are at times so numerous and so absurd as to puzzle the modern collector and cause him to speculate on the acumen of some of the connoisseurs of the past. With some of these small bronzes the metamorphosis is not in the form but in the inscription that sometimes accompanies the plaquette, but on other occasions the subject and the figures are considerably altered. As an example of the former we may quote the supposed portrait of Julius Caesar of the Quirezio collection. In this case the plaquette bears the inscription Julius C. pp. PM, which has caused the wrong naming of this bas relief, for an identical plaquette, formerly in the collection of Mr. Bardini of Florence, seems to indicate that it must be a question of Cicero. The second inscription runs thus: M. Tullius, CPPPM. As for the second method, the alteration of the form and subject of a plaquette, the fancy displayed by the makers borders upon the grotesque. To begin with a mild form of metamorphosis, let us follow the subject of Apollo and Marsyas in its transformation from the original cameo that was in the collection of Lorenzo il Magnifico, and, according to Muntz, is now in the Naples Museum, together with many others from the same collection. In this cameo the god is on the right, playing the lyre held in his left hand. Marsyas to the left has his hands tied behind him, between the two figures kneels Olympus, a pupil of Marsyas, interceding for his doomed master. The supposed original in the Naples Museum bears but one inscription, Lor Med, evidently standing for Lorenzo Medici, but Giberti tells us that on this cornelian around the said figures were antique letters spelling the name of Nero. There is nothing strange in this, nor in the presupposition that the cameo had been Nero's private seal, as one knows he was fond of playing the lyre, but what casts some doubt on the authenticity of the Naples cornelian stone is the fact that the Berlin Museum possesses a bronze plaquette, evidently a reproduction from some antique cameo, with the inscription to which Giberti alludes, Nero Augustus Germanicus P. M. Tr. P. Imp. pp. The cornelian stone kept in the Naples Museum has no inscription, and for this reason is supposed by some to be a reproduction from the original ordered by Lorenzo Medici. The plaquette of the Berlin collection is thought to be cast from the original Greek cornelian stone, though there are other reproductions in various museums, one for instance in the Louvre very similar to the one of Berlin, another in the collection of Quirezio with the inscription Prudentia Puritas Tertium Quod Ignoro. Mr. Quirezio also owned two more copies of this subject, one similar to the one in the Louvre with the addition of a border, the other of larger dimensions, with the figure resting on a ground in the form of a crescent. A bas relief of this subject, used as an ornament of the pommel of a sword hilt, and very similar to the other plaquettes, was in the De Villiers collection. N. Schliefer and Giovanni Boldu, 1457, treated the favourite subject with a certain plagiarism of the Greek model. In Boldu's bas relief Apollo is in the usual attitude, but the other figure has disappeared. There are many other plaquettes, with small variations, in private collections. There is also a plaquette of this subject in the Dreyfus collection, in which Apollo has become a woman and Marsyas is playing the flute. Evidently the subject must not only have been popular among collectors, but must have caught the fancy of artists as the composition of Apollo and Marsyas is reproduced in the bas relief of a fine door, formerly of Cremona and now in the Louvre Museum. The one at Naples is repeated almost identically in a cornelian of the Cabinet des Médailles in a portrait of a young girl, attributed to Botticelli, in the Stadel Museum of Frankfurt. On the frontispiece of the work executed for Matthias Corvinus, on a frontispiece of the Sforzade, that rare work kept in the library of the Riccardi in Florence, on a majolica dish of the 15th century, now in the Correr Museum in Venice, there is a plagiarism of this subject in a work by Raphael in the Vatican. The following examples, however, are perhaps more typical of an intentional transformation, a somewhat reversed case and an exception to the rule in this sort of faking, namely a Christian subject turned into a pagan one for the benefit of the 15th century amateurs. There still exist in San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome two bas reliefs representing two incidents in the life of the saint who has given the church its name, one when he is arrested and put to prison, the other when he is chained in his cell and liberated by the angels. The two bas reliefs, wrongly attributed to Pollaiolo, were ordered from some Roman artist in the year 1477 by Sixtus IV, then a simple cardinal. Of each of these bas reliefs there is a modified reproduction, one in the Louvre and the other in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the modifications of both are such as to make people believe them to be pagan subjects and antique work. In the reproduction kept in the Louvre, the transformation of the subject without much alteration of the work is so evident that we can see how easily old collectors were taken in by these curious pieces of truquage. Of a more naïve but no less efficient character is the transformation inflicted upon the bas relief of Kensington. Here, in order to transform the miraculous liberation of St. Peter into the freeing of a Roman senator, it has sufficed to clip the angel's wings, both inside the prison, the work being divided into two different moments of the action, and where the saints usher the apostle into the street. There is no reason to disbelieve the supposition that this piece of faking was perpetrated to cater for the mania of the art lover of the time. As a matter of fact, the Louvre bas relief was considered an antique till but recently, and that of the Victoria and Albert Museum, which entered the collection wrongly labelled as the work of Giberti, was believed before 1863, when it was acquired by the museum, to be a work of the classic Greco-Roman period. As for over 3 centuries they have passed as genuine work of the Roman Empire, it is not reasonable to suppose that the amateurs of the time were wiser than the succeeding generations of connoisseurs who believed the work to be antique. This fact is eloquently brought out in the case of the work preserved in the Louvre, as this bas relief was not hidden but has quite a long and well established pedigree. Among other migrations we can trace it to Malmaison in a sort of select collection of objects coming from Italy. Edme Durand bought it as an antique and in the belief that it was antique kept it in his collection. The Louvre Museum also bought it for an antique, and for quite a long time classified it in the catalogue, number 280, as an Etruscan bronze. It would take too long to trace all the transformations of small bronzes made for the benefit of the 15th and 16th century amateurs, the many reproductions with changes. Of the metamorphoses to which plaquettes were subject we can mention another curious example in which a crucifixion has become a rape of the Sabines. And as a case in which a popular subject has caused many reproductions, we quote the Palladium of the Niccoli collection, which has been reproduced by Donatello, Niccolò Florentino, etc. The statue of Marcus Aurelius also seems to have been a cherished subject for small statuettes from that by Filarete given to Piero Medici in the year 1465 to reproductions of the 17th century. Of all the workmen of that fertile period running between the 15th and 16th centuries, Moderno was the most active and versatile. There is hardly a mythological subject that has not been treated by him. His imitation of the antique is at times quite convincing, more especially that belonging to the early period of his career. Later on, when he enters into what might be styled his matured 16th century temperament, he seems to suffer from the same trouble as the imitators of the first third of the same century, namely over polish and mannerism, which must in fact have been considered an improvement in imitation. Valerio Belli, a sculptor and famous cutter of precious stones and rock crystal, was quite justified in reproducing the subject of his own carving in the small bronze bas reliefs that now play such an important part in modern collection of plaquettes, and which in times gone by must have been the delight also of past collectors. They often bore his signature, which speaks eloquently for the fact that there was no intention to dupe anyone. There were also other artists who evidently had a hand in faking antiques. They belong more or less to various schools, but chiefly to those of Padua and Venice. The Paduan school is in this respect fortified by the names of Vittore Camillo, Cavino, Bassiano. Almost every bronze founder is associated with an imitator of the antique, either a maker of statuettes, inkstands, perfume vases or plaquettes of various sizes and use. Thus, for a second time Italy became a gorgeous market of imitation, very often in itself such good art as to be worthier than the art counterfeited. One of the last of these imitators was Tiziano Aspetti, to whom, rightly or wrongly, small bronzes of private collections are attributed. From the Anonimo Morelliano one gathers that there was a period in which a gentleman could hardly afford to do without a little collection of antiques. The bronze figurines are modern by various masters and are derived from the antique, remarks this Anonimo of Morelli, as though explaining that there were some collectors perfectly satisfied with this, and perhaps the silent accomplices of a fine piece of faking. The Anonimo tells us that there were many such pieces in the collections of either ignorant or accommodating collectors and art lovers in the house of Marco Bonavido of Padua, and that of a rich merchant of the same city, the sculptor Aviso; in Venice, in the collections of Adoni and Zuano Ram. They are often mingled with genuine antiques, which causes the Anonimo, who evidently thinks himself either a connoisseur or a well informed chronicler, to say here or there, the many bronze figurines are modern, or the many medals are of modern bronze, or the medals are most of them antique. Precious confessions, as one can see. We know but vaguely of imitations in painting, but an assembly of such versatile artists can hardly have refrained from imitating the work of some master. Besides, the very teacher at the head of a school did not seem to resent it even if a pupil signed the name of his master. But as regards imitating the antique, there were hardly any samples to imitate. The grotesques of the old Roman ruins may have suggested to more than one artist a new type of decoration, but this plagiarism, if it can be called so, though not without influence on 15th and 16th century art, found no practical issue with fakers. There is, however, an incident in which a piece of faking saved to Florence a masterpiece of Raphael. It is related by Vasari in Andrea del Sarto's life. According to Vasari, when Frederick II, Duke of Mantua, came to Florence, he greatly admired the portrait of Pope Leo X, the magnificent painting now hanging in the gallery of the Pitti Palace in Florence. His admiration turned to such greedy desire of possession that when he reached Rome he begged the then all-powerful Clement VII to procure it for him. The Pope agreed to the Duke's request and ordered Ottaviano Medici, then residing in Florence, to have the painting packed and sent to Mantua to Duke Frederick. Ottaviano Medici, a lover of art and a Florentine, hating to deprive his city of such a work, was yet not inclined to resist the wish of the Pope and resorted to a ruse. He informed the Pope that the painting should be sent to the Duke, according to His Holiness's order, as soon as the frame had been repaired. The Duke of Mantua was also informed that the frame needed re-gilding and that the painting should be shipped as soon as the repairs were finished. With this excuse Ottaviano Medici gained the necessary time and ordered from Andrea del Sarto an exact copy of Raphael's work, a copy that all experts would mistake for the original. The work was done to such perfection that even Ottaviano Medici, who was an art connoisseur, could not tell the original from the copy. The pseudo-Raphael was sent off, the Duke was duped and one of the finest portraits by Raphael was saved to Florence. In Vasari there are comments here and there which lead us to think that many others may have been duped by the versatility of the 15th and 16th century painters. We know that Bellini's pupils finished 3/4 of some of the great Venetian masters' works, that Calchar imitated Titian so well as to be taken for the great Vicelli, but we do not know to what extent lovers of art of this time may have been duped. As for sculpture, we may close this study by quoting what Vasari writes in the life of Vellano. So great is the power of counterfeiting with love and care any object that, more often than not, if the style of one of these arts of ours be well imitated by those who delight in the work of whoever it be, the thing that imitates so closely the thing imitated, that no difference can be detected except by the most experienced eye. Of Giberti, a collector and versatile sculptor, Vasari tells that he took much pleasure in imitating the dies of ancient coins and medals. which comment amply justifies the observation that the learned Milanese adds to the life of Valerio Belli, who at times, according to Vasari, forgot to add his signature, and was extremely clever in counterfeiting antiques from which ability he derived very great benefit. Antique medals, says Milanese, were very much in demand about this time, consequently forgers and imitators abounded. They had in fact multiplied to great numbers and fostered the art of counterfeiting to its highest perfection. End of chapter 8.